So, in Western Europe, in contrast to the development of land empires by Russia and China, sea empires were built by Spain, England, France, and Holland, which is also known as the Netherlands or the Dutch in the Americas. The English, French, and Dutch colonies in the Caribbean and in what would become the United States became part of the mercantile system. Colonies provided raw materials as part of the European powers' goal of global economic strength. France, England, and Holland were also similar to Spain and Portugal with regard to their religious policies in the Americas. They converted natives to Christianity, but were generally less insistent on mass and immediate conversion than the Iberian nations. By the 17th century, Europeans had established ports in East Asia, Southeast Asia, India, and the west coast of Africa. In general, involvement in international trade positively affected local and regional economies. In areas where direct trade was not possible, Europeans negotiated special economic rights. And just a side note about the African ports, Europeans were deterred from entering the continent by the risk of contracting malaria and by the lack of navigable rivers. So they just kind of stayed on the outskirts in the port cities. Monarchs in Spain and Portugal were more directly involved in governing their colonies than were the monarchs in England, France, and the Netherlands. Viceroys were like assistant kings over their colonies, and they reported to the king in many matters. And the result was a very strict chain of command, with all kinds of matters, important and trivial, being sent to the king for a ruling. Now, given the huge distance between the Americas and Europe, an answer to a local question could take months. In addition to the American empire, Spain and Portugal added territory in the Pacific and the Indian Oceans. The Philippines had been claimed during the explorer Magellan's round-the-world voyage in the early 16th century. Spain was eager to have a base near the riches of China and a population to convert to Christianity. Portugal established some outposts along the Atlantic and Indian Ocean coast of Africa and India, but it was not able to achieve sweeping colonization as it had in Brazil. The Dutch, French, and British colonies were run differently from those in New Spain or Brazil, with more decision-making on the local level and little micromanagement from Europe. And historians say this style of government is one reason why the British American colonies along the Atlantic coast gradually drew apart from the Crown in London, and American colonists became used to running their own affairs, and this fostered a spirit of independence from the Crown. So let's talk about what governments in Europe were actually set up like. Now, other major powers in Europe besides Russia, France, and Spain were under absolute monarchies during this era. An absolute monarchy, all of the government's power resides under one ruler, and it said that the king was above the law, meaning that the law did not necessarily apply to the king. Each king had advisors in a parliament, but it all served for the monarch's pleasure. They also believed in the concept of divine right, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Some common characteristics of European monarchs: they had very strong armies, and they spent a lot of money to maintain them. They had a complex and elaborate bureaucracy. Again, that took a lot of money. They had high taxes to support the frequent wars which they waged on the European continent. And they also believed in this concept called the divine right of kings. And this divine right held that the monarchs were granted their right to rule by God. And this is similar to the mandate of heaven in China. In France, a system of absolute monarchy arose as the monarch stopped convening the Estates General, which was a medieval parliament system. In addition to the characteristics of monarchs, territorial expansion was a goal of the strong military that the absolute monarchs assembled. And the most noteworthy of the European absolute monarchs was Louis XIV of France. He not only adhered to the doctrine of divine right, but he also lived extravagantly in his palace at Versailles outside Paris. And this is a picture of him right here in your PowerPoint. Keeping with absolutist tradition, Louis XIV spent huge sums of money on the military in order to carry out numerous wars to expand French territory. Again, the prevailing economic theory of the day was mercantilism, and this encouraged nations to export more than they imported and promoted the founding of colonies. That's why it was so important that they have a large army so they could go out and conquest. Colonies provided that raw material and ready markets for the manufactured goods produced by the mother country. The English system was a major exception to the trend of absolute monarchy. In 1689, its parliament firmly established a constitutional monarchy during the Glorious Revolution. And the Glorious Revolution followed the English Civil War, and basically what it did was place the power of the parliament over that of the king. They still have a monarch, they still had a king. Even to this day, they are considered a parliamentary monarchy. However, what that means is that they are ruled by a centralized government, but England limited the power of its monarchs with a parliament, and they ended up sharing power with representatives chosen by voters from the elite class. And England's style of constitutional monarchy eventually became the style of government in which all European kings would accept. Now, it is important to discuss nation-states. Government in Europe was organized around the nation-state, and it was well suited to a continent composed of various cultural groups like Europe. So a nation-state is defined as a political unit that governs people who share a common culture, including language, has definite geographic boundaries, and enjoys sovereignty. And the European nation-states were governed by either absolute or parliamentary monarchs, and the number of nation-states on the small European continent, however, created rivalries and divisions that often led to war.